On August 16th of 1980, the Australian family the Chamberlains went on a camping trip to Uluru, formerly known as Ayers Rock, the famously titanic sandstone rock formation on Australia's Northern Territory. Designated as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, Uluru is sacred to the Anawu people and is the site of numerous freshwater springs, watering holes, rock caves, and ancient Aboriginal paintings. And naturally, due to the immense natural beauty of the area, Uluru has been a popular tourist destination for almost 100 years. The Chamberlains' first day and night camping in Uluru were relatively uneventful, and the family passed the time relaxing at their campsite while their children played atop the red, sandy earth. Keeping an eye on 7- and 4-year-old sons Aidan and Regan proved to be a handful, as their parents had welcomed their daughter Azaria into the world just 2 months prior. Some might argue that it was a little too soon after labor to go on a camping trip, but the pregnancy had been a hard one, and both Lindy and Michael Chamberlain were desperately in need of some rest and relaxation. But the trip would ultimately prove to be anything but relaxing, and would in fact turn out to be every parent's worst nightmare. According to both Michael and Lindy Chamberlain, they had first spotted a pack of dingoes shortly after they had made camp on August 16th. A dingo is a kind of Australian wild dog, one with a remarkably similar appearance to contemporary domesticated dogs. But that's where the similarities to our familiar furry friend ends, as dingoes are said to be considerably faster, stronger, and much more ferocious than domesticated canines. It became apparent that the dingoes could smell the family's food cooking away on a small camping stove, and slowly but surely they edged closer and closer to the camp. At first, the closer encounter with such wild creatures thrilled the Chamberlains, with Michael even tossing them a few sandwich crusts for them to feed on. Yet unbeknownst to him, that would prove to be a huge mistake. For the previous 2 years, Uluru Chief Ranger Derek Roth had been writing to the local government to warn them of an uptick in the region's dingo population. Due to an abundance of natural prey, the years leading up to 1980 saw an explosion in the number of dingo packs that roamed the region. Increased numbers caused a strain on the dingo's natural sources of prey, and soon, more and more packs were finding themselves with considerably less to eat. As a result, dingo packs were becoming increasingly aggressive, approaching and sometimes biting people, and Derek Roth warned that it wasn't long before something terrible occurred. Which is why when Michael Chamberlain threw those crusts, and the dingoes identified the family as a source of potential food, he'd inadvertently put his family in serious danger. Then, around 8 p.m., Michael and Lindy put their children to bed and returned to the campfire to get a moment alone together. Sometime later, the couple heard something moving around the tent where their children were sleeping. Assuming it was just one of them rolling around in their sleep, they didn't seem to think much of it. But when they heard one of their young sons cry out in terror, the couple leapt into action. They arrived at the tent, finding that each of their young sons were terrified, but otherwise unharmed. Azaria, however, was nowhere to be seen. The Chamberlains asked their sons where Azaria was, but they didn't have an answer. Each had been asleep, and they were awoken by some rustling at the mouth of the tent, but it was far too dark and far too sudden for them to work out exactly what it was. The two parents searched frantically around the nearby area, but not a trace of their daughter could be found. And the sad truth was that neither Michael nor Lindy would ever see their baby girl again. But that's not what makes this abduction story so horrifying, as the pain and suffering of the family didn't end with the abduction of their daughter. And for Lindy in particular, things were about to get unimaginably worse. As you might imagine, police were called in and the campsite was blocked off before forensics examiners pored over the tents and surrounding area. They noted animal prints on the floor of the tent, and a park ranger found what he believed to be dingo tracks leading from the tent and off in the direction of some rocks near the base of Uluru. Police followed the faint trail, and to their horror, found blood-stained clothes belonging to the 2-month-old Azaria. The initial inquest into Azaria's disappearance was opened in Alice Springs on December 18th of 1980. 2 days later, in the first ever live broadcast of Australian court proceedings, Magistrate Dennis Barrett ruled that the most likely explanation for the child's disappearance was a dingo attack. However, Barrett had a rather chilling addendum to his statement, adding that following the initial dingo attack, the body of Azaria was taken from the possession of the dingo and disposed of by an unknown method, by a person or persons, name unknown. This is based on the fact that there seemed to be evidence suggesting that someone had actually undone some buttons at some point after Azaria had been taken. This was a horrifying enough revelation from the parent of any missing child, but the police's conclusions turned a living nightmare into marching through hell when they accused Lindy Chamberlain of murdering her own child. Northern Territory police and prosecutors had always suspected Lindy's involvement in the disappearance of her own daughter, and even after the investigation was officially concluded, officers continued to work the case. This led to a second inquest in September of 1981. Based on ultraviolet photographs of Azaria's jumpsuit, medical experts alleged that there was a tiny cut around the neck of the baby's jumpsuit recovered from the surrounding bush. Essentially, they were implying that someone had cut a 2-month-old baby's throat, that someone was evil enough to murder young Azaria Chamberlain. And in their view, that person was her own mother. We can only imagine the horror of the moment Lindy was accused of killing her own tiny baby. The universe had somehow found the one solitary way of compounding the mind-breaking grief she was experiencing. It was like a sick cosmic joke, and she no doubt told herself that it couldn't be happening. Only it was. It was reality. Lindy was about to stand trial for the murder of her own newborn baby. At her trial, the state prosecution had alleged that at some point, and with her husband's consent, Lindy had gotten up from the campfire and walked over to the tent in which her children slept. She then carried a sleeping Azaria to their family's car, changed into a pair of tracksuit pants that she intended to subsequently dispose of, then used a pair of scissors to cut her 2-month-old daughter's throat. Then, according to prosecuting attorneys, Lindy held her baby upside down by the ankle and waited for it to bleed to death. Expert witnesses claimed that there was no evidence of arterial bleeding from the jumpsuit bloodstains, and it would take up to 20 minutes for Azaria to die if her mother had cut her jugular vein and not her aorta. Allegedly, when Lindy was sure that Azaria was dead, she hid the body of her young daughter in a camera case and tried not only to clean up any blood that had gotten on the car, but also to collect enough of it to smear on the interior of the children's tent to simulate some kind of animal attack. The prosecution said she did all that without ever attracting the attention of any other camper, and that this all went unnoticed during the first inquest due to a combination of luck, careful concealment, and painstaking planning on the Chamberlain's part. Lindsay's defense lawyer focused on eyewitness statements which detailed the dingoes that were in the area on the night of August 17th. It also pointed out that many of the tests used by the prosecution to prove that Azaria's blood was in the car were faulty, and showed that mucus and chocolate milkshakes also tested positive for blood using these same techniques. The defense also called on a man named Les Harris, who at the time had been conducting research into the Australian dingo population for well over 10 years. It was him that testified that a dingo's carnassial teeth can shear through material as tough as motor vehicle seatbelts. He also cited an example of a captive female dingo removing a bundle of meat from its wrapping paper and leaving the paper intact. To the Chamberlains, it seemed like a foregone conclusion. There was an airtight explanation for their daughter's disappearance, a tragic one, but surely no jury would favor the idea of a mother murdering her baby daughter over the increasing encroachment of aggressive predatory animals. But they did. On October 29th of 1982, a jury of her peers found Lindy Chamberlain guilty of the murder of her own baby girl, with the judge then handing down a sentence of life imprisonment. Her husband Michael was found guilty as an accessory after the fact and was given an 18-month suspended prison sentence. As she was dragged away, a horrified Lindy Chamberlain loudly protested her innocence, apparently screaming out, "A dingo ate my baby," before bailiffs managed to escort her from court. I think it's objectively difficult to imagine how horrendous it would be to lose a child, only then to be convicted of that child's murder. In the prison she was held in, Lindy found she was the subject of a phenomenal amount of hatred. To her fellow inmates, she was a child killer, the lowest of the low. Those that had it in them to kill children, to kill babies, didn't deserve to live themselves, and as a result, Lindy had to be held in a special wing of the prison reserved normally for those in protective custody. She was in a unit with actual child killers, predators and abusers that looked at her and thought, "One of us." The trauma of that no doubt played a part in Lindy repeatedly lodging appeals, 2 of which were quashed by both the federal and high courts of Australia. For almost 6 long years, Lindy remained in prison, trying to keep it together, trying to fight on. But there came a time where she believed that her luck had run out, and that she was doomed to spend the rest of her life in prison for something she hadn't done, something she'd never even think about doing. It's believed that her outlook became so bleak that she considered taking her own life. But every time, thoughts of Michael and her 2 young sons kept her from entertaining such masochistic ideas. And it's a good job too, because in early 1986, an unforeseen event would once again turn the media spotlight back onto the disappearance of Azaria Chamberlain. And in the bizarre twist of fate, justice would bloom out of yet another untimely death. David Brett had a passion for climbing, and sometime in the mid-1980s, David decided he'd combine his love of mountaineering with an Australian vacation to a bird's-eye view of the land down under. But as it would turn out, David's attempt to climb Uluru would be the last thing he'd ever do, as he tragically fell to his death during a routine climb in early 1986. Because of the vast size of the rock and the scrubby nature of the surrounding terrain, it was 8 days before Brett's remains were discovered, lying below the bluff where he had lost his footing. His body showed evidence of having been picked over by some kind of scavenger, and this is how search and rescue operators found the dingo lair just meters away from David's body. To ensure the dingoes hadn't dragged any of David's body parts into their cave with them, operators scoured the cave for potential remains and came across something stunning. It was a tiny baby-sized matinee jacket, one that had belonged to none other than Azaria Chamberlain. The Chief Minister of the Northern Territory ordered Lindy Chamberlain's immediate release and reopened the investigation into Azaria's disappearance. Then, on September 15th of 1988, the Northern Territory Court of Criminal Appeals unanimously overturned all convictions against Lindy and Michael Chamberlain, and they were officially declared not guilty of their daughter's murder. 2 years later, the Chamberlains were awarded $1.3 million in compensation for wrongful imprisonment, a sum that covered less than 1/3 of their legal expenses. They were outraged. They wanted an apology. They wanted justice. But what the Australian government chose to give them was a slap in the face. It took until February of 2012 for the Northern Territory coroner, Elizabeth Morris, to offer an official apology for the injustice the Chamberlains had faced. But by then, it was too little too late, and the horror of what the family endured could never be erased or forgotten. But perhaps what's more abstractly horrifying about the accusation of Lindy Chamberlain was just how willing the general public were to believe that she'd killed her baby. By all accounts, the media's representation of the case was highly polarizing, and the case is now used as an example of how media and bias can adversely affect a trial. There have been many accounts of people spreading fanciful rumors or making sick jokes about the child's disappearance, and how newspapers were keen to sell a story of an evil, murderous mother simply because it sold more copies. People also judged Lindy on the way in which she grieved, with some saying her media appearances made her look cold and unsympathetic. They said she didn't cry enough, that she didn't seem broken enough, and as a result, people chose not to believe her. Much was made of the Chamberlains' Seventh-day Adventist religion, including false allegations that the church was actually a cult that killed infants as a part of a bizarre religious ceremony. At one point, police received an anonymous tip from a man who claimed to be a close associate of the Chamberlains and that Azaria was a name that meant sacrifice in the wilderness in some ancient satanic language. According to the Chamberlains, Azaria actually means blessed by God, and by all accounts, the man was nothing more than a lunatic. But it goes to show just how willing people were to paint Lindy as some kind of witch. And much like the witches of Salem, Massachusetts, Lindy was publicly sacrificed to satisfy some primal craving for justice. Like it couldn't have been an accident, it had to have been someone's fault. Someone had to be sacrificed. Azaria's death became such a worldwide phenomenon that it's been referenced in all kinds of media, including The Simpsons and Buffy the Vampire Slayer. In fact, you probably heard the phrase, "Dingoes ate my baby," way before you even knew what a dingo was, and there's a good reason for that. It's because the world is a big, scary place, and it's still full of monsters. And the idea that even in 1980, nature could still reach out and hurt us, so seemingly randomly, for many, that was a bitter pill to swallow.
This happened earlier in the year. I was on vacation in Costa Rica with my family, and one other family as well. Not counting me, the 17-year-old female, there were 3 other girls there, my sister Sophie of 14, my friend Julia of 15, and her sister Michaela of 11. Mac and Julia belonged to the other family. We were staying at a resort that had a massive pool. It was later at night, probably around 10ish, and our families decided that we were going to the pool for a swim. This was our second day, and we had gone on a volcano hike earlier, so we were looking forward to hanging out for a bit. The parents dashed off to the swimming bar that was up in one of the pools, and us kids decided we were going to go to the water slide, which was in a completely different area. I was the oldest and fairly responsible, as well as being a certified lifeguard, so the parents had little problem leaving me in charge of the rest of the girls. The 4 of us hung out in the pool, having a grand old time for a while. We all took turns going down the slide. It was kind of scary actually. And after a while, the 2 youngest ones, Sophie and Mac, went off to find the parents and hang out with them for a bit. Julia and I stayed to go down the slide a few times. The slide was set up so that there was a long set of gradual steps that would wind up the side of this hill thing and into another little pool at the top, near the top of the slide. On the far side of this pool, there were a few more steps that led to the actual entrance of the slide. There were only a few trees and bushes that separated the steps from the resort road. By the entrance to the slide, there were no trees or anything that you could access the entrance from the road from. To put it simply, we had an obscured view to the road and vice versa. Anyway, Julia and I were standing at the top of the slide waiting for the last little kid to go down before we went. The kid went, and we kind of stood up there for a bit, just talking and taking advantage of the lack of younger siblings, when we heard this motorcycle drive by behind us on the road. We turned around, and sure enough, a man on a motorcycle was just cruising down the street. We didn't think anything of it and went down the slide. When we came back up for another go, the man was just sitting on his motorcycle out on the road. He wasn't blatantly watching us, but when we turned to look, he would find something to do and look away. Julia and I are teenage girls, and we're in pretty good shape, so it was creepy but not super weird that this dude was looking at us. We went down the slide a few more times each, and this dude would drive up on his motorcycle. We were pretty creeped out at this point, so we left. Julia and her family went to their room, and me and my family went to ours. I was in the bed closest to the window, and so I was the only one in my room who saw a headlight or something drive up to our window. We were on the bottom floor, and I leaned over and pulled back the blinds a little because it was late, because I wanted to know who was blasting their headlights in. Sure enough, it was the motorcycle dude. I was quite shaken, so I woke up my dad, who went out onto the patio, and as soon as he saw him, because my dad stands at 6'1" and is 200 pounds, the motorcycle man sped off. I stayed close to my family for the rest of the trip. Needless to say, creepy motorcycle man peeping on underage girls, let's not meet.
It was a day like any other. My cousins and I decided to go to a Western-themed amusement park near Anaheim, California, to spend some time together, as we were all on the cusp of adulthood and haven't been to an amusement park together since we were kids. All was going well. It was hot, the lines were long, and after riding rides all day, our feet were killing us. We planned to stay until the park closed, so we were waiting at a roller coaster that faced towards the children's section of the park, while also planning where we would go next. During our planning and waiting in the long line, we heard 3 distinct pops. We assumed that they were fireworks or general theme park noises, so my cousin's boyfriend made a little bit of a joke that someone just got popped. We thought nothing of it and continued to wait. All of a sudden, a large wave of people came running through the children's section of the park. I figured a ride that had been closed opened up and people were flocking to be first in line. But then an even larger wave of people came after. I saw parents hiding their kids in the bushes where the rides were, ride operators rushing people off of the rides they were on, and everyone around me asking what the F is going on. That's when the most chilling words I've ever heard in my life came over the ride speakers. Get down. Active shooter. We ducked down and were absolutely terrified. My oldest cousin's boyfriend was crouching down saying that we needed to get the F out of there. But considering the line we were in was elevated and faced directly where everyone was running from, we knew we couldn't stay there. After a minute of sitting there, a girl from above us told us we need to get out of the line and leave. So we ran down the ramps of the line, passing by a crying lady holding her 2 crying kids, who looked me in the eyes and said through tears, "This is not a drill." That's when I knew I had to be serious. We ran to a wall and waited there while crouching. I was praying that me and my family could get out of there alive. My oldest cousin was calling her parents, and there were children around us who were just crying. We had to keep moving, so we got up and ran towards the back of the park to find the emergency exits. My cousin's boyfriend asked an employee where we could find one, but they didn't respond. They just stared at him blankly. We decided to follow a mob to the horse trails where the stagecoach goes around. We ran up a large ramp on the trail so we could get to the front of the park. Suddenly, we were told to go back and get down. People were running back, and we all thrashed around until we were all sat down on the floor. I saw the police outside the park, and lights of the park were turned off other than the decorative lighting. We were sitting ducks. If a shooter was in the park, we were out in a high, open, visible area. I called my mom and explained the situation, but all she could do was tell me to leave where I was, but she didn't understand that if I ran back or forward, I'd be right in the path of the shooter. I looked around to see hysterical people. A father was having a breakdown because his daughter wasn't with him. A girl was crying because she was alone with her little brother. And the one that got me the worst was a little boy who came to the park to celebrate his birthday, sobbing and telling me that he just wanted to see his daddy again. I tried to reassure him that he'd be all right and that he'll see his father again, but that he has to stay quiet and behind us. Earlier, my one cousin let her little sister wander off with her 2 friends while we went to ride the roller coaster, and we had no idea where she was. So they ran off by themselves to go and look for her. We were stuck up there for 10 or 20 minutes. My youngest cousin was crying, and her sister was going to start crying after seeing her. It was just chaos. But eventually a group of people came from behind us to cross the bridge. We followed them to the bottom of the ramp, to which we were met by an employee who informed us the shooting was a drive-by and that we were safe to leave the park. We walked out, all shaken up, and my mom told me that we should still be careful as they could come back. Once we got to our car, we made sure our one cousin was all right. They found their sister and her friends in a candy shop, hidden with a ton of kids crying. Once we got on the freeway, we were home free and could finally breathe. The whole experience was traumatic, to say the least. While we may not have been in too much danger looking back, not knowing where the shooter was and the panic of all the people in the park combined left all of us hesitant to go back to an amusement park for a long, long while.